I also wanted to show you something in terms of scale. You don't have this picture, Michelangelo's David. You don't have a picture of it in the textbook, and if you did, you still wouldn't necessarily see the scale of it. This, once again, is at that same cemetery where they have a bunch of kitsch sort of art, knockoffs, clones of famous pieces to sort of lend dignity to the place. It was a handy way for me to get a picture of me standing next to the David, and you'll see it's rather large. When Michelangelo carved this, he selected a block of marble that had a rather odd shape. It's interesting what his feeling was about carving. Michelangelo, of course, being another one of the great masters of the Renaissance in the time of Da Vinci. What Michelangelo did here was to suit the shape, the pose of this statue, to the shape of the block of marble he had to work with. But he always regarded what he was doing as liberating the form that was encased within the marble. He didn't see it as creating this shape out of a block of marble that was just a solid piece of rock. He envisioned this figure in the marble, and all he did was remove the stone that had covered it up. Very interesting philosophical way of regarding what he did. Whether you picture it that way or you picture it in a more traditional way, you can't escape the fact that the artistry that he captured here paralleled, and some people would say even surpassed, the art of the ancient Greeks. Back to Leonardo da Vinci. Another very famous artwork is the Mona Lisa. In fact, as Gombrich also points out, it's so used and abused on postcards and even in advertising that we can sort of take it for granted. But let's look at the real thing, which hangs in the Louvre in Paris. There's always been a mystery surrounding it because many times when people look at this, they tend to see it differently with every glance. We know that Da Vinci actually consciously used certain techniques to do this. He was such a master of it, he could get away with it. For one thing, if you concentrate on the background here, how does it fit together? This background actually seems at a lower level than this background here. There's a body of water here, there's a body of water here. How do you have such a thing? What's in between, behind this woman's head, that would make that possible? The fact of the matter is, Da Vinci did this on purpose. Da Vinci purposely drew this side at a lower level than this side, so that if you happen to be looking at the left side of this picture, she looks taller. If you happen to be focusing more on the right side, she looks shorter. This accounts for part of the fact that you sense a difference here. Has the painting changed? We really don't think so, but your perception of it has changed. Another thing that he did in a very clever way, although oil allowed him to capture much greater detail, you'll notice the folds of the cloth here, and even the detail of the wrinkles on the fingers, and this lace work here. Oil, because it dried slower, allowed the artist to paint much longer and capture this kind of detail, as we saw with Van Eyck. But here in the face, where he could have used that capability to draw things like around the eyes and around the corners of the mouth, by making these areas less distinct, rather than as detailed as oil painting would allow him to do, Da Vinci made it possible to more or less obscure what her emotion really is, because it's actually at the corners of the mouth and at the corners of the eyes that you sense emotion. If a person is smiling in a big way, there'll be lines here. If they're happy, there may even be wrinkles here because of the way the eyes pinch together, and maybe areas like this would droop a bit if a person were sad. What he does is he leaves to the imagination of the viewer these things. So in a way, your own mood is reflected in what you interpret in this painting. And that's a rather subtle psychological cue. That's another reason why the Mona Lisa may look different to you at different times. The mismatch continues just a bit in a way that, once again, if you focus on half of the face and then the other half, it tends to look different. If you look at this here, comparing the left and the right side, you can see that there's kind of a mismatch in terms of the face. This eye is larger than this one, fairly much larger. More so than a face looking flat onto you would have this one diminish in size because of perspective. It's a bit mismatched. That's another reason this may look a little bit different. So all things taken together, Da Vinci did some clever things here. And he understood, because of the studies he did in the way people perceive things and the way nature was, he was able to do this, and actually it was no accident that this painting is the way it is. That's one of the things that makes it such a great work of art. This is a close-up of those same areas, and what we're talking about here in terms of deliberately blurring, that is, making it much less clear than it could be given the capabilities of oil paint, that's a technique called sfumato, S-F-U-M-A-T-O. Now, because it involves this kind of shading also as a means of obscuring things, it's easy to confuse that with another Italian word, chiaroscuro, which is shading to give circularity. And you can see some of that effect here, this circularity of the eyes being sunken in because of the shading. We detect that. And in fact, the nose has a shape because of chiaroscuro, that type of shading. Related to that, in a way it would seem, because it uses some of the same techniques, is this essentially unrelated technique of sfumato, which is to obscure some of the details that would reveal too much emotion, to leave that somewhat in doubt. Just as we took a look at a little bit of what Verrocchio had done, who owned the workshop in which Da Vinci learned, Ghirlandaio was the owner of a workshop and an artist in his own right, where Michelangelo first worked. Ghirlandaio isn't remembered as being a very great artist. He's remembered as being a very capable painter who chose subject matter that reveals something of the lives of aristocrats in the Italy in which he lived. Here we have the Virgin Mary being born, not Jesus, but his mother. But it's as if she's born in an aristocratic household in Florence. These are all interested people coming to visit, pictured much as the aristocrats who might have commissioned an artwork like this. It was popular, and it shows us something of what people looked like at the time, and it has a rather stock element here of a relief of little children carved as statues, because that let the artist demonstrate that he was skilled in that type of artistry as well. And here's a close-up of that reveals just a little bit more of the detail and the very fine texture of the clothing here. Obviously, very much a master at that type of detail possible with oil painting. And you see a little bit of use of linear perspective here in terms of those elements, and these as well. Once again, it would seem a vanishing point here being chosen as the center of the painting. Let's take a look at something much more masterful. This is one of the masterpieces that Michelangelo created, and the story is that he was actually interested in doing statuary for a very large mausoleum that Pope Julius II wanted to commission for himself. However, between the time that the Pope suggested this to Michelangelo and Michelangelo went off to select the marble for it, took about 6 months. When he came back, the Pope had changed his mind. He had decided that instead of placing a tomb in the old St. Peter's Basilica, they would tear down the old St. Peter's Basilica and build that monumental dome you saw earlier on that medallion. This certainly didn't please Michelangelo, and after a period of time when he decided he wasn't going to do anything for the Pope, he eventually was persuaded to come back and actually undertook this commission, which was not much to his liking, to paint what was at that time a plain ceiling here in what's called the Sistine Chapel. Now, the Sistine Chapel was built by one of the popes named Sixtus. That's where the name comes from. At the time that Michelangelo was commissioned to decorate the ceiling, the walls had already been painted by very famous painters of an earlier generation. And it shows on one side the life of Moses, and on the other side the life of Jesus. These paintings depict a lot of parallels that are drawn in those two lives. At that time also, this wall was not painted.